For centuries, the feudal system was the bedrock of medieval Europe, and within this system, of lords, vassals, servants, and clergy, women lived invisible but fundamental lives. This is the portrait of those who sustained the Middle Ages with their own hands, and who, even subjugated, found ways to resist, love, and exist. The stage of feudalism. Feudalism emerged between the 9th and 15th centuries on a continent under reconstruction after the fall of the Roman Empire. It was a world of castles, villages, and monasteries where land was the main source of power. Society was organized in rigid layers, the king at the top, then the nobles, the knights, the clergy, and at the bottom, the peasants and serfs. In this scenario, the role of women was determined by their origin. Birth defined everything: what she could wear, what she could eat, who she could marry, and even what she could dream of. A peasant woman and a noble lady lived such different realities that, despite both being women, they almost seemed to belong to different worlds. But there was something in common. Both were bound by the rules imposed by a patriarchal system that saw the feminine as fragile, sinful, and subordinate. The peasant woman, the invisible pillar of the village. Most medieval women were born in the countryside. They were servants linked to the land of a feudal lord. They worked from dawn until nightfall. They plowed, harvested, took care of the animals, prepared food, sewed clothes, and educated their children. His life revolved around survival. Marriage between serfs was an institution controlled by the lord. In many cases, the woman needed permission to marry or move to another village. Widows were sometimes forced to unite again, to ensure that the land remained productive. Freedom was a non-existent luxury. The houses were simple, with mud floors, thatched roofs, and constant smoke. Diseases were common, births dangerous, and infant mortality high. Even so, women sustained the life cycle of the fief. Without them, there was no food, no fabrics, and no continuity of the peasant lineage. They were treated as part of the gear, useful, necessary, but rarely respected. Still, in the midst of anonymity, there were moments of dignity, in the harvest festivals, in exchanges with other villages, or in the stories told by firelight, where they transmitted wisdom from generation to generation. The noble woman, between luxury and prison. At the top of the feudal pyramid were the women of the nobility. At first glance, they seemed to live a life of privilege: castles, fine fabrics, servants, banquets. But his reality was another form of captivity. From an early age, noble girls were educated for marriage. They learned embroidery, etiquette, music, but also household accounting and servant management. Marriage was always a political contract. It united families, strengthened alliances, and expanded territories. Love rarely had space. Many were betrothed as children, marrying at the age of 12 or 13 to much older men. After marriage, they became key players in the networks of power, and paradoxically, also prisoners of their new homes. The noblewoman owed obedience to her husband and loyalty to his family. Its main function, to generate heirs. When her husband left for war or crusades, she took charge of the castle. He managed lands, collected taxes, supervised serfs, organized defenses. She was a temporary but competent ruler. Still, chroniclers rarely mentioned their names. They were shadows that kept the structure standing while men sought glory. Some, such as Eleanor of Aquitaine, defied their time, commanding armies and deciding the fate of kingdoms. But they were exceptions, and for this reason remembered with fascination and fear. The body and control. In the feudal system, the female body was a social and political property. Virginity, marriage, and motherhood were treated as exchange goods. A pure woman had value. A woman who deviated from these norms was considered a threat to order. The church played a crucial role in this control. He preached that the woman descended from Eve, and therefore carried the guilt of original sin. Their duty was to obey, to serve, and to remain chaste. Pleasure was seen as sin, silence as a virtue. The punishments for adultery or improper behavior were severe. Women could be banished, imprisoned in convents, or even executed. Men, on the other hand, generally received pardons or fines. The moral double standard was a brutal reality. Female sexuality was surrounded by fear and mistrust. Even in marriage, the woman's body belonged to her husband. It was a marital obligation to satisfy the husband and bear children. However, records of letters and chronicles show that, even under repression, many women found subtle ways to express desire and affection through poems, embroidery, or songs. The religious, power and enclosure. For some women, monastic life was an escape. The convent offered protection, education, and a certain autonomy that the outside world denied. Within the monasteries, abbesses could manage estates, hire workers, and exchange correspondence with officials. It was a space of knowledge and feminine power rare for the time. Women like Hildegard of Bingen wrote scientific treatises, composed music, and challenged dogma. His spiritual influence went beyond walls and borders. But not all vocations were voluntary. Many young women were sent to convents by decision of their families, as a way to save dowries or control inheritances. The cloister for some was a prison disguised as devotion. Even so, these spaces preserved part of the medieval female voice. It was the nuns who wrote letters, diaries, and compilations that today allow us to understand the interior of the female feudal soul. Education and culture. Female education was the privilege of a few. In the field, knowledge was passed orally from mother to daughter. Women learned to cook, plant, mend, heal with herbs, and raise children. This domestic knowledge, although despised by literate men, was vital for the survival of the community. In the courts and monasteries, some women learned to read and write. They produced poetry, copied manuscripts, and in rare cases, wrote their own works. The courtly literature of the 12th and 13th centuries, which extolled pure love and devotion to the lady, helped shape a new feminine image, more idealized, but still distant from reality. She was the woman transformed into a symbol, muse, saint, or sinner. The real woman, who bled, worked, and aged, remained hidden. Violence, law, and punishment. Violence against women was a constant, legal, domestic, and symbolic. The husband had the right to correct his wife, and feudal or ecclesiastical authority rarely interfered. The laws varied, but almost all recognized the man as the head of the home and master of the female body. Cases of rape were treated as offenses to property, not to the victim. The aggressor owed compensation to the woman's father or husband, not to her. If the victim was a servant, the punishment was minimal. A woman's word was worth little in male-dominated courts. Still, there are records of resistance. In some villages, women banded together to protect each other. In late medieval cities, they formed guilds and women's confraternities. And in witchcraft trials, many have found the strength to challenge power, even in the face of death. Love, motherhood, and loss. Despite the harshness, there was tenderness. Love, when possible, flourished in the intervals of duty. Dedicated mothers, faithful wives, supportive sisters. Motherhood was both blessing and sentence. Every birth was a risk, every child lost, a wound. Letters from nobles reveal an unexpected sweetness. Wives writing to absent husbands, mothers mourning children in battles, sisters exchanging advice. In the villages, women created support networks. They helped each other in childbirth, shared food, shared secrets. This primitive sorority was one of the few possible refuges. In the midst of a society built on male power, affection between women was a silent act of resistance. Changes and transformations. Over time, feudalism began to crumble. Commerce was reborn, cities grew, and new opportunities emerged. Urban women began to work as artisans, merchants, and midwives. Some widows inherited businesses and gained economic independence. The emergence of universities, however, continued to exclude the female gender. The literate culture was still male. But on the margins of history, women persisted, writing, trading, teaching, loving. Gradually, the feudal rigidity dissolved, and the seeds of change, planted by women's hands, began to germinate. The forgotten legacy. The feudal system ended, but its marks remained for centuries. The idea of women as submissive, dependent, and inferior has crossed generations. Still, history proves it. Even in times of oppression, they acted, created, sustained, and transformed the world around them. They were seamstresses of destiny, guardians of the land, ladies of the home, and, above all, survivors. Today, as we look back, we find that the history of women in feudalism is not just about suffering, it is about resistance. It is about calloused hands that have built walls and protected lives. It's about minds that dreamed of freedom in times of servitude. And it is about a silent truth that time finally reveals. Without them, the Middle Ages would not have existed. The echo of the past. We may never know their names. Perhaps they are buried under the dust of centuries, without tombstones, without portraits, without songs. But every village, every castle stone, every line written by a monk bears the trace of them. Women who loved and were loved, who suffered and resisted. Women who lived and died within a system that ignored them, but which, paradoxically, depended on them to exist. Because, in the end, feudalism was built on the silent shoulders of these women, and on the unbreakable force that no history has been able to erase.